Johnny Cash was led away in handcuffs. Then Elvis stepped forward and said this. The metal cuffs closed around Johnny Cash's wrists. No stage lights, no cheering crowds, just the cold silence of a small Tennessee police station. His career, his reputation, everything he had built, was suddenly hanging by a thread. He sat alone, exhausted, waiting for a future he could no longer control. Then suddenly, the phone rang. The officer froze. His voice changed, and moments later, Elvis Presley walked through the front door. He didn't smile. He didn't wave. He looked directly at Johnny, and what he said next wasn't just about saving him from jail. It was about saving the man himself. But the real truth is, Johnny Cash never forgot those words, and neither will you. Welcome to the channel, a place where the moment's history, almost forgot, finally get remembered. If stories like this still mean something to you, don't forget to subscribe, not for us, but to keep these memories alive. Because people who lived through this era understand what these moments truly meant. And before we begin, tell us something important. Where in the world are you watching from tonight? The sound of metal closing around Johnny Cash's wrists was louder than it should have been. It was just a small click, but in that quiet police station, it echoed like something permanent. He didn't resist. He didn't argue. He didn't say anything at all. He simply stood there, his hands now locked in front of him, staring at the floor like he was trying to understand how he had arrived at this moment. Just hours earlier, he had been somewhere else entirely, somewhere normal, somewhere safe. Now, everything felt different. The officer beside him adjusted his grip slightly, guiding him forward, not roughly, not gently, just firmly enough to remind him that he was no longer in control. Johnny's boots made slow, heavy sounds against the hard floor as he walked down the narrow hallway. The station was small. Too small. Too small. It smelled faintly of paper, old coffee, and something else he couldn't name. The fluorescent lights above him flickered softly. Every detail felt sharper than usual. Every sound felt louder. Every step felt heavier. An officer ahead of him opened a metal door. It creaked as it moved. Inside was a holding cell. Nothing more than metal bars, a small bench, and silence. The officer gestured inside. Johnny stepped forward without hesitation. He sat down slowly. On the bench, the metal was cold beneath him. The door closed behind him. Another loud sound. Another click. Another moment he couldn't undo. He leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees. His hands, still locked together, felt unfamiliar. Strange. He stared at them. Not angry, not afraid, just tired. Very tired. He hadn't slept properly in days. Maybe longer. He wasn't even sure anymore. Time had started to blur together. Road after road, city after city, show after show. The same lights, the same songs, the same expectations. People always expected him to be strong, to be steady, to be Johnny Cash. But right now, sitting in that small holding cell, he didn't feel like any of those things. He felt human, fragile, exposed. He closed his eyes for a moment, not to escape, just to breathe. Outside the cell, the officers moved quietly. One of them sat at the desk, writing something on a piece of paper. Another leaned back in his chair, watching. Not watching Johnny directly, just watching. Johnny could feel it anyway. He opened his eyes again. With a station clock on the wall ticked steadily. Each second felt slower than the last. He didn't know what would happen next. He didn't know how long he would be there. He didn't know how much damage had already been done. His career, his reputation, his life. Everything suddenly felt uncertain. He leaned back against the wall behind him, closed his eyes again. He tried to clear his mind, but thoughts kept coming. Questions he couldn't answer, regrets he couldn't fix. The silence around him felt heavier. He had been alone before. He had traveled alone, stayed in hotel rooms alone, driven long roads alone. But this was different. This wasn't chosen. This was forced. He opened his eyes again and stared at the metal bars in front of him. They weren't thick. They weren't dramatic. But they were enough. Enough to separate him from everything else. Enough to remind him that things had changed. An officer stood up from the desk and walked toward the phone. The phone rang suddenly, sharp, unexpected. Johnny didn't react at first. Phones rang all the time. It didn't mean anything. The officer picked it up. "Police station," he said calmly. He listened. His expression didn't change. At first, Then slowly, something shifted. His posture straightened. His tone softened slightly. "Yes, sir," the officer said. Johnny noticed it. The change, small, but real. The officer listened carefully. He glanced toward Johnny's cell for just a moment, then looked away. "Yes, sir," the officer repeated. Johnny's heartbeat slowed. He didn't know why, but he felt it. Something was happening. Something unexpected. The officer listened for another few seconds. Then he nodded slightly, even though the person on the phone couldn't see him. "I understand," he said. He paused. Then he spoke again. "Yes, sir. He's here." Johnny's chest tightened. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He just listened. The officer's voice became quieter now, more respectful. Johnny leaned forward slightly on the bench, trying to hear, trying to understand. The officer said one more thing before hanging up. "Yes, Mr. Presley." The name hung in the air. Johnny froze. He wasn't sure he had heard it correctly. Presley. Elvis Presley. His mind struggled to catch up. Why would Elvis be calling here? How would Elvis even know? The officer placed the phone down carefully. He didn't speak immediately. He just sat there for a moment, thinking. Johnny watched him, waiting. The officer finally stood up. He walked slowly toward the holding cell. He stopped a few feet away. He looked at Johnny differently now. Not like before. Not like he was just another person sitting behind bars. Something had changed. "He's on his way," the officer said. Johnny blinked slowly. He wasn't sure what to say or what to feel. He didn't ask questions. He didn't need to. He understood. Elvis was coming, but he didn't understand why or what would happen next, or what Elvis would say when he arrived. Johnny leaned back against the wall again. His heart beat steadily in his chest. For the first time since he had been placed in the cell, something inside him shifted. Not relief. Not yet. Something else. Uncertainty. Hope. Fear. All mixed together. He closed his eyes again. Not to escape. To prepare. Because somewhere outside that small police station, Elvis Presley was already on his way. And whatever happened next, nothing would ever be the same again. Just 12 hours earlier, Johnny Cash had been standing in a recording studio in Nashville. The lights were warm. The room smelled faintly of wood, wires, and old music. Everything looked normal. Everything sounded normal. But Johnny didn't feel normal. He stood behind the microphone, headphones resting against his ears, listening to the playback of his own voice. The sound was strong, steady, confident, but inside, he felt none of those things. He looked through the glass window into the control room. The producer gave him a small nod, waiting for approval. Johnny nodded back. Automatic. Top it. Automatic. He removed the headphones slowly and placed them down on the stand. His hands moved carefully, but they weren't steady. They hadn't been steady for a while now. No one said anything. They didn't need to. Everyone in that room respected him, admired him, needed him to keep going. He had become more than a man. He'd become an expectation. Johnny stepped away from the microphone and grabbed his jacket. It felt heavier than it should have. Everything felt heavier lately. The drive outside was quiet. The sun was already setting, casting long shadows across the empty road. Johnny got into his car and closed the door behind him for a moment. He didn't start the engine. He just sat there. His hands rested on the steering, wheeled it still. His eyes stared forward, but his mind was somewhere else. He couldn't remember the last time he felt rested, the last time he felt clear, the last time he felt like himself. Tour after tour, show after show, city after city, people cheering, people watching, people expecting, always expecting. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small bottle. He stared at it for a moment, not with pride, not with comfort, just familiarity. It had become part of his routine, part of survival. He placed it back into his pocket. He didn't open it. Not yet. He started the engine. The car hummed to life. Beneath him, he pulled onto the road and began driving. The sky above him was turning darker now. Night was coming. The road stretched endlessly ahead, empty, silent. Johnny drove without turning on the radio. He didn't want noise. He didn't want distraction. He just drove. His eyes followed the road, but his thoughts wandered. He remembered when everything had felt simpler, when music had been enough, when he had been enough, before the pressure, before the exhaustion, before the expectations. His grip on the steering wheel tightened slightly, blinked slowly. His vision blurred for just a second. He shook his head gently. trying to stay focused. He was tired, too tired. He hadn't slept properly in days, maybe longer. He couldn't remember. He passed a small roadside sign, but he didn't read it. He didn't care where he was. He just wanted to keep moving. Somewhere behind him, headlights appeared, distant at first, then closer. Johnny didn't notice them. Immediately his mind was elsewhere. The headlights stayed behind him, steady, watching, waiting. Then suddenly red and blue lights flashed bright, sharp, unavoidable. Johnny blinked, his heart skipped. He looked into the rearview mirror. The police car stayed close behind him. The lights continued flashing, silent but loud. Enough. Johnny didn't panic. He didn't run. He simply slowed the car and pulled over to the side of the road. The engine idled quietly. He placed both hands on the steering wheel. Still weight in the night around him was completely silent. He watched in the mirror as the officer stepped out of the car. The officer walked slowly toward him, confident, certain. Johnny's breathing remained steady, but inside, something felt fragile. The officer knocked lightly on the window. Johnny rolled it down. "Evening," the officer said. Johnny nodded. "Evening." The officer studied his face carefully. "You been driving a long time tonight?" Johnny paused. "Yes." The officer nodded slowly. His eyes moved across the inside of the car, observing, judging, not accusing. Not yet. Johnny remained still, calm, but tired. So tired. Mind stepping out of the vehicle, the officer asked. Johnny didn't argue. He didn't question. He simply opened the door and stepped out. The air outside was cold, colder than he expected. The officer stood beside him now, close enough to see everything, close enough to notice what others might miss. Johnny stood there quietly. He wasn't angry. He wasn't defensive. He was just present. The officer spoke again. "We're going to need to ask you a few questions." Johnny nodded. He understood, even if he didn't want to, even if he didn't have the strength for it. The officer's flashlight moved across the car. Slowly, carefully. Johnny watched without speaking. He had nothing to hide, and yet, everything suddenly felt exposed. Minutes passed, or maybe seconds. Johnny couldn't tell. Time had started to move differently. The officer finally turned back toward him. "We're going to need you to come with us." Johnny didn't ask why. He didn't protest. He didn't resist. He simply nodded because somewhere deep inside, he already knew something had been building for a long time, and tonight, it had finally caught up with him as the officer guided him toward the police car. Johnny looked up at the dark sky above him, empty, silent, endless. He didn't know where this moment would lead. He didn't know how much it would cost him. He didn't know that somewhere else, miles away, another man had just heard the news. A man who understood everything Johnny was feeling. A man who wasn't going to let him face it alone. Elvis Presley had just picked up the phone, and he had made a decision. He wasn't going to ignore this. He wasn't going to stay silent. He was already reaching for his keys, and before the night was over, he would walk into that police station, not as the king, but as a friend. The sound of the station door opening was quiet, almost too quiet at first. No one looked up. The desk sergeant continued writing. One officer leaned back in his chair, half focused on the paperwork in front of him. Another stood near the wall, arms crossed. It was just another night, just another shift, just another man sitting behind metal bars. But then they heard the footsteps, slow, steady, confident, the kind of footsteps that didn't rush, the kind that didn't hesitate. The desk sergeant looked up first. His pen stopped moving. His eyes narrowed slightly, then widened. He stood up without us, realizing he was doing it. The other officers followed his gaze, and suddenly, the entire room changed. Elvis Presley stood in the doorway. He wasn't dressed like a star, no. Stage clothes, no spotlight, just dark jeans, a plain jacket. His hair slightly out of place from the long drive. He looked like any other man, except he wasn't. There was something in his presence, something calm, something controlled, something undeniable. He stepped forward slowly. The sound of his boots against the floor echoed softly. No one spoke at first. They didn't need to. Everyone knew who he was. Everyone understood why this moment mattered. But Elvis didn't look around the room. He didn't acknowledge the officers. He didn't acknowledge anything. His eyes were focused on one place, the holding cell. Johnny Cash sat inside, his hands still locked together. He hadn't moved. Not when the door opened, not when the room changed. Not until now. He looked up slowly. Their eyes met. For a moment, neither man spoke. They didn't need words. They understood. Johnny felt something he hadn't felt all night. Not relief, not recognition. Elvis stepped closer to the desk. Sergeant, his voice was calm when he spoke. I'm here. For Johnny Cash. No anger, no threat, just certainty. The sergeant cleared his throat. He suddenly felt smaller than he had before. Yes, sir, he said. Sir, he hadn't used that word earlier. Elvis didn't react. He didn't acknowledge the change. He just stood there, waiting. What are the charges? Elvis asked quietly. The sergeant explained. His voice was less confident. Now, less certain. He spoke carefully, respectfully. Elvis listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't argue. He simply absorbed every word. When the sergeant finished, Elvis nodded. Slowly. Then he spoke again. He hasn't hurt anyone. It wasn't a question. It was a fact. The sergeant hesitated. No, he admitted. Elvis nodded again. He hasn't caused damage. Another fact. Another truth. The sergeant shook his head. Slightly. No. Elvis's voice softened even more. He's exhausted. No one disagreed. No one needed to. It was obvious. Elvis glanced toward the holding cell. Again Johnny was watching him. Still silent. Still unsure. Still fragile. Elvis turned back to the sergeant. I know this man, Elvis said quietly. He didn't say Johnny Cash. He said this man. It mattered. He's not what this moment makes him look like. The words hung in the air. Heavy. Honest. Real. The officers listened. Not as officers. Anymore as people. Elvis continued. He's been carrying more than most people understand. His voice never rose. Never forced. But every word carried weight. He doesn't need punishment. He paused. He needs help. The sergeant shifted slightly. He looked toward Johnny, then back at Elvis. He wasn't sure what to say. Elvis stepped closer. Not aggressively. Not threatening. Just closer. I'll take responsibility for him? The room froze. The words surprised everyone. Even Johnny. Elvis didn't hesitate. He didn't doubt. I'll make sure he gets home safely. His voice was steady, certain. I'll make sure he appears wherever he needs to appear. The sergeant stared at him. Studying him, trying to understand. You're giving your word? The sergeant asked quietly. Elvis nodded once. Yes. One word. Simple. Final. The sergeant looked down, then back up. He believed him not because Elvis was famous, because Elvis was sincere, because Elvis was sincere, because Elvis meant it. Stayed silent for a long moment. Then the sergeant spoke. Give us a minute. Elvis nodded. He stepped back slightly. He didn't celebrate. He didn't smile. He just waited. The officers spoke, quietly among themselves. Phone calls were made. Papers were moved. Time passed slowly. Johnny remained in the cell, watching, listening, trying to understand what was happening, trying to understand why Elvis had come, why Elvis cared, why Elvis hadn't turned away. Finally, the sergeant returned. He walked toward the holding cell. He unlocked the door. His sound echoed loudly. Johnny stood slowly. His legs felt unsteady, not from weakness, from emotion, from disbelief. The handcuffs were removed. The metal loosened, then gone. Johnny stared at his hands. Free, but changed. He stepped forward. Elvis stood just a few feet away, waiting. Not as a king, not as a legend, as a friend. Johnny didn't speak at first. He didn't know what to say. There were no words big enough. No words strong enough. Elvis spoke instead. Come on. His voice was gentle. We're leaving. Johnny nodded slowly. They walked toward the exit together. The officers watched in silence, not with judgment, with respect. The door opened. The cool night air waited outside. Johnny stepped into it, free, but not the same man who had walked in earlier. Behind him, Elvis followed. He didn't lead. He walked beside him, equal, present, real. As they reached the car, Johnny finally spoke. His voice was quiet. He didn't have to come. Elvis looked at him, his expression calm. Yes, Elvis said. I did. Johnny didn't understand yet. Not fully, but he would. Because what Elvis had done wasn't just about tonight. It was about something deeper, something permanent, something that would stay with Johnny for the rest of his life. They got into the car. The engine started. The road stretched ahead. Silent, waiting. And in that silence, Elvis was about to say something that would change Johnny Cash forever. The road ahead was empty. Only the headlights cut through the darkness. Johnny Cash sat in the passenger seat, staring forward, his hands resting quietly in his lap. Just minutes ago, those same hands had been locked in cold metal. Now they were free, but freedom didn't feel the way he thought it would. It didn't feel light. It didn't feel easy. It felt fragile. Elvis Presley drove beside him, both hands steady on the wheel. He didn't turn on the radio. He didn't fill the silence with meaningless words. He understood something important. Some silences needed to exist. Some silences helped people breathe. Johnny watched the road pass beneath them. The dark trees blurred together. The world outside looked the same, but inside, everything had changed. He still couldn't fully understand what had just happened. Why Elvis had come. Why Elvis had spoken for him. Why Elvis had believed in him. After nearly 20 minutes of driving, Elvis slowly pulled the car off the road. That small rest area, empty, quiet, safe. The engine stayed running. Neither man moved at first. Elvis finally turned slightly. In his seat, he didn't look like a king. He didn't look like a legend. He looked like someone who understood pain. "Johnny," Elvis said quietly. Johnny turned his head. It was the first time they had truly faced each other since leaving the station. Elvis's eyes were calm, but serious. That moment back there, Elvis paused. "It doesn't define you." Johnny felt the words settle inside him. He wanted to believe them, but belief wasn't easy. Not anymore. Johnny looked down at his hands again. "They saw me," Johnny said quietly. His voice carried something deeper than embarrassment. "They saw me weak." Elvis shook his head slowly. He leaned forward slightly. "He saw you human." The words stayed in the air between them. Johnny didn't respond immediately. He didn't know how to, because for so long, he had been trying not to be human, trying not to be weak, trying not to be fragile, trying to be the man everyone expected. Johnny Cash, the strong one, the unbreakable one. But tonight, that man had disappeared, and all that remained was him. Elvis continued. "You think I haven't had nights like that?" Johnny looked at him, surprised that Elvis didn't smile. He didn't hide. "I've had moments where I didn't recognize myself." Johnny listened carefully. "Moments where I didn't know if I could keep going," Elvis said quietly. The honesty in his voice was unmistakable. Johnny realized something then. Elvis wasn't speaking as a legend. He was speaking as a man, just like him. Elvis looked directly at him. "The difference is, someone reminded me who I was." Johnny's chest tightened slightly. "And tonight," Elvis said softly, "I'm reminding you." Johnny swallowed. The words reached deeper than anything else had. For months, maybe years, he had been losing himself, slowly, 1 mile at a time, one show at a time, one silent moment at a time. He hadn't noticed when it began. He hadn't noticed when it took control. He hadn't noticed when he stopped recognizing himself. Until tonight, until those handcuffs, until that cell. Until Elvis walked through that door. Johnny's voice was barely above a whisper. "Why did you come?" Elvis didn't hesitate. "Because I know what it feels like when no one does." The answer was simple, honest, real. Johnny closed his eyes briefly. He felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time. Not relief, not yet, but something. Understanding. Elvis spoke again. "You've got a choice now." Johnny opened his eyes. Elvis's voice was calm, but firm. "You can let this be the moment that breaks you." He paused. "Or you can let it be the moment that saves you." Johnny stared at him. The words didn't feel dramatic. They felt true. Elvis reached forward and gently rested his hand on the steering wheel again. "This world," Elvis said quietly, "it'll take everything from you if you let it." Johnny knew that already. He had felt it happening, slowly, quietly. Elvis turned the engine off. The sudden silence was complete. "You've given people your voice," Elvis continued, "but you can't lose yourself in the process." Johnny listened. Every word mattered. Every word stayed. Elvis looked at him one last time. "You're still here, Johnny." Simple words, but powerful. Johnny felt his breathing steady for the first time that night. Maybe the first time in months. He wasn't thinking about the arrest. He wasn't thinking about the officers. He wasn't thinking about the cell. He was thinking about the future. Something he had been avoiding. Something he had been afraid to face. Elvis started the engine again. They drove the rest of the way in silence, but it was a different silence now. Not empty, not heavy, meaningful. When they reached Johnny's home, Elvis parked the car and turned it off. Johnny didn't move immediately. He looked forward, then slowly turned toward Elvis. He wanted to say something important, but words felt small compared to what Elvis had done. Finally, he spoke. "Thank you." 2 words, but they carried everything. Elvis nodded. "That's what friends do." Johnny stepped out of the car. He stood there for a moment, watching Elvis. Elvis didn't wait for applause. He didn't wait for recognition. He simply nodded once more and drove away. The headlights disappeared into the darkness. Johnny stood alone, but he didn't feel alone anymore, because Elvis had done something far greater than speaking to officers, far greater than paying bail. He had given Johnny something he didn't realize he was losing himself. Years later, Johnny Cash would stand on stages again. He would sing again. He would face crowds again, but he would never forget that night. Not the cold metal, not the silence, not the moment Elvis Presley walked through that door, not the one word Elvis gave the officer. His word, and the one promise Elvis gave Johnny, that he was still worth saving. Because sometimes the moment that feels like the end is actually the moment someone reminds you who you are.